Okay, I want to take you back for just a moment to when you were a kid. And I want you to think about how many times your parents told you no. You know, we say that to our kids all the time. No, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. In fact, they think that as a child, you probably hear that about 148,000 times as you grow up. That's a fraction of the time that developers hear the word no from their sysadmins when they want to go ahead and do stuff. We're not the greatest at saying yes to things, but there's a reason that our IT ops people and our sysadmins say no, and there's a reason that parents say no. Generally, parents say no because sometimes when they say yes, they know their kid is going to end up in the emergency room. It's a protection mechanism. We are saving yourself from yourselves. And when we say no to some things in the IT world, we're trying to prevent headlines like this. Companies with millions of dollars in assets going bankrupt because of the money that they're spending. Or ending up as one of the data breach headlines because things weren't set up and configured securely enough. What we end up with, though, is this kind of battle between good and evil. We hear from the business units and we hear from our developers, say it with me, I feel the need for speed. And if anybody in this room doesn't get that reference, then you're a lot younger than I am, let's just put it that way. And on the other side, we have the sysadmins that are going, negative, goes right out, the pattern is full. And we all know how that story worked out, right? Good old Maverick went ahead and did it anyway. So what's the answer? Is it time to get rid of the sysadmins? Are we going to burn the witches and get rid of our server huggers? Because, hey, we're putting everything in the cloud. We don't need them anymore, right? Maybe we just replace them with a machine. And that, in essence, is kind of what we're doing with cloud-native governance. What we're doing instead is giving people the ability to put the controls and the policies into the cloud engine and have that doing the enforcing. So instead of having to fill out a big long change control form and come along to my change control meeting and have somebody approve or deny what you want to do, let's get smarter and build those controls into the cloud engine. We can still set up and configure those policies, and we can have real-time enforcements or denying of changes that you want to make to configurations or resources in the cloud, but we still have a level of control over what's going on, and we still maintain the speed of being able to try stuff and go ahead and deploy stuff and know that it's all going to be controlled and compliant to our policies. The way we do that inside Azure looks a little bit like this. So our architecture governance is built into our Azure Resource Manager. That's the thing that is the control plane in Azure. And we put in our policy definitions, our role-based access controls, our ARM templates, and then any time that a request hits that fabric, whether it's through the Azure portal, the CLI, even a third-party tool, the Azure Resource Manager will evaluate that request against those policies and then pass on what the result is going to be into things like compute, storage, network configuration, and those kind of things. So I'm going to give you some tips for how we can do that. First tip, organize your cloud things. We have something called the Cloud Adoption Framework, which is guidance for best practices on how to do this inside Azure. I'm going to give you a brief Azure one-on-one, and I don't know how many of you are Azure customers in the room. Subscriptions are the things that take money out of your bank account. That is literally the level at where the bill gets processed and the money comes out of the account or the spend is attributed to. Inside the subscriptions, we can bundle together resources inside resource groups. And now we can put this management layer over the top called management groups. And with management groups, we can enforce things across more than one subscription. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about when I'm talking about organize where you're putting your things in the cloud, so you don't end up with a whole bunch of stuff just inside one resource group. for example. So here's an example. Tailwind Traders are a retail store. They've got some applications here, and they've got a couple of resource groups inside one of their production subscriptions. They've also got a mirror of that. Really good idea to have a test environment. So they have a test subscription that's got a duplicate of those resource groups for a test environment for those applications. They've got a few more than one subscription though. They've got some other applications, and so they mirror those with production and again with tests. So now you can see we're starting to scale up a bit in terms of the number of resources that we're trying to manage and getting a bit of structure underneath them. Now what we can do is we can bundle all of those together and go, all of these subscriptions have got production environments in them. There are certain things that we want to enforce or make sure that are in place or make sure that they do not happen inside our production environments. Let's put those policies in at a management group level, and they'll apply to all the subscriptions, resource groups and resources inside that part of our cloud. Our test environments can be slightly different. So we might want to have lesser controls, more controls. We might want to make changes to the policies that we've got in those test environments to check whether they're going to break anything before we then go and adjust the policies that we've got in production. So we can do that too. And what we can also do is write a big box around all of this and go organisational level control. Let's put in an org level management group to say, I don't care if it's a production or a test environment. If it's inside my org, I want to enforce this thing or make sure that this thing never happens. Tip number 2, tag your cloud things. Resource tags in Azure are one of the most overlooked features and one of the handiest. So let's just jump in and take a quick look at what our tags look like. So I've got some resource groups here inside one of my subscriptions. And if I go into this particular resource group, it's actually sitting up here under tags. Now, at the moment, I don't think this resource group actually has a tag on it at the moment. So I've put a tag in there called alias, and that's my name. Really handy when you want to find out why something's costing a lot of money and who you need to yell at about it, to be able to go in and go, who created that? Who's the owner of that thing? Or I can go ahead and say, well, look, maybe I want to add an environment tag and say that this is actually our development environment. So I'll go ahead and add that in. Now this is an easy visual to see through the Azure portal. You can do this through your Azure Resource Management templates, PowerShell, all of those different kinds of ways. When you create and modify resources, you can do that with tags as well. And you just need to note that if you tag something at the resource group level, that doesn't tag the resources inside that group. So you actually need to go and tag the resources separately. It's a separate command. Resource tags means that we can categorize things across different resource groups and subscriptions. So it doesn't matter where they are inside that structure that we put up earlier. I can run a report or I can run a command that says, I want this to run against everything that is tagged with this particular tag name and this particular tag value. Also really handy for cost management reporting, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. We can identify common tags. So figure out what's important to your organization to be able to group things together. Do you want to know cost centers, application owner, what part of an application is this particular thing part of? I mean, a virtual machine, for example, that's a VM and some storage and some networking and some other bits and pieces that we've got turned on. They're all separate resources. But if we want to put one common tag on them to make them easier to bundle together and report on and act on, we can do that with our taggings. Again, supported by the portal with your templates, PowerShell, the Azure CLI, and your REST API. And we can enforce the usage of those with the Azure policy. So we can make sure that people can't delete them. Or we can make sure that they get added when people spin up new resources in our cloud. Next tip, restrict who can do what with role-based access control. Role-based access control is kind of like files and folders permissions. It's who can do what to that resource in the cloud at a resource level through the Azure Resource Manager. So we're not talking about authenticating at the application level in terms of what you can do inside the app. This is for people who are logging into Azure, into our Azure portal. What can they do against those resources. So we can segregate that access, give them a really tight level of detail about what they can and can't do. We can grant those permissions to people or groups of people, even better. Grant it to the group, manage the group membership. We can grant it to service principals and managed identities. So service principals is the identity that a resource will have to act against another resource. And managed identities work kind of the same way as well. When we're programmatically trying to do something, we need to have an identity to act to make sure that it's authorized to do the thing. With our role-based access control, we have about 70 definitions at the moment of what we consider to be standard roles that somebody might want to do and the associated permissions with them. If they don't fit, you can build your own. So you can define your own custom roles and what those permissions are that they have. So, quick look at role-based access control. I'm going to go into one of my resource groups. Now, role-based access control lives under access control IAM because it makes sense that that doesn't actually say RBAC or role-based access control, but that's what we're looking for. It's our identity and access management. Now, I can control that RBAC stuff at a resource level, at a resource group level, at a subscription level, whichever I want. And so here I'm down in this resource group level. So the thing that I'm going to add in here is just going to apply to this resource group and the resources inside it. I'm going to go and add a role assignment, and I'm going to look at, which one shall I pick? Azure Events Hub. Let's have a look at the Azure Events Hub data owner. Okay, so the Azure Events Hub data owner is a particular role that is about who's got access to do things against the Azure Events Hub and the data that's in that. I can assign access to, I'm going to put in just a username here, so let's put in Rick and pick on my boss, and we'll give him access to that. And that's as simple as it is. And again, we can do this programmatically if we want to, but that means that Rick now has access under the Azure Events Hub owner role. But if I go into role assignments and actually see, there's another one down here. So Rick also actually has network contributor access, and we can see that he's getting that because I added it at the subscription level. And this resource group has inherited that from that top level parent. So that's something to check out. If you're playing with your RBAC stuff and the roles that the person's got or the access they've got doesn't quite seem to match, it might be because they're inheriting it from a different part of the scope, or they might be part of a different AD group that you've given access to, for example. And just know that when you turn this stuff on, it can take up to about 30 minutes for that to actually take effect and update in all our places for that to happen. So I mentioned that you can build custom roles. Now, benefit of using the built-in roles is that if Microsoft changes anything, like we go and change the names of things, as we sometimes do, we will update the built-in roles so they still work. You can go and build your own, and this is an example of setting one to give somebody the ability to monitor and restart virtual machines. It's a very granular level of detail. It literally means that they can go into the virtual machine inside Azure. They can't stop it. They can't make changes to any of the properties of that virtual machine. And we're talking about the Azure properties of it, not logging into the virtual machine itself. But they can restart it. Really handy for giving to somebody like your help desk team, where you want to turn around and say, if this thing dies at 2 a.m., try restarting the VM before you ping us to say that it's failed, because it might get you up and running faster than we can wake up the on-call person and get them to log into their laptop to figure out what's going on. Good stopgap measure. So this lists all of the different actions that that person would need to have, and we can put deny actions in there if we want, and then the subscriptions of where this would actually apply. Okay, Azure policy. Now, this is where the rules and regulations come into play. So with Azure policy, we're building rules to audit, configure, or deny the creation of our Azure resources. We are defining what conditions we're looking at. we're able to put some parameters in. So we might turn around and say, I want to look at this thing here, but when I apply the policy to this subscription or this resource group, I want to tweak what the actual value of that thing is allowed to be. And then what level? Where is that policy being applied and what's it auditing? So there's a few things that we can do with these policies. We can say, if something isn't there, go and add it. We can say, audit it and just show me whether or not the thing, the resource, is compliant with this policy or not. We can do an audit if things aren't there. We can deny resources from being created. We can make sure that things do get deployed if they're missing. Now, the deploy if not exist one is actually really important at the moment for virtual machines. Virtual machines, when they plug into services like Azure Log Analytics, or when we're doing some monitoring of the configuration inside the virtual machine, we need to have some VM extensions turned on. And so the deploy if not exist can make sure that if those extensions are missing, if they get turned off by a mistake, that might mean that we're not monitoring stuff that we should be, or stuff isn't compliant and enrolled as it should be. So we can make sure we put that policy in to redeploy those VM extensions to make sure that they're always there. We can disable things, we can modify things like modifying the tags and the tag values, for example. And we've also got this one called enforced reject policy, which is related to Azure Kubernetes service and containers. So that's a fairly new one. Anytime you see the word preview in Azure, it means that it's a service that we have released out into the wild in our Azure portal for you to use, but we are still tweaking it. It doesn't quite comply with all of our SLAs yet, and it is still subject to change. But in the right environments, especially in your test environments, we would love people to actually use it because that gives us some really good metrics and actionable feedback on our stuff. So let's take a look at Azure policy. So in our Azure policy overview here, we're showing a few compliance. The fun gets into our assignments and our definitions. So our definitions are literally where the policy lives and what it is that we're looking at. And you can actually tell that I've got quite a few by default that are already here. I'm going to go and create a new one. Now, we've got two types. We've got a policy definition or an initiative definition. Difference being an initiative is a collection of more than one policy. The good part about doing more than one policy together in a bundle is it means that I can track it and enforce it as one thing. We have a policy called Enable Monitoring in the Azure Security Center. Enabling monitoring in the Azure Security Center is a good thing to do. You want to know that your resources are secure, and by making sure that they're surfaced in the Azure Security Center, we can be alerted if there's some issues with the configurations of those. That initiative consists of about 70 separate policies. And I don't want to see a dashboard that lights up 70 different line items when I can just see that it's out of compliance on that one initiative definition, and then I can drill down into the level of detail to find out which of the individual ones it's not compliant with so I can fix it. But I'm going to create a new initiative because I'm a little bit freaked out about how much we're spending in the cloud at the moment. I'm going to call it expensive SKUs. So I'm going to put it in my custom category to make it easier to find. And under here, here's my available definitions. I've actually got a couple. So I've got allowed storage account SKUs and allowed virtual machine SKUs. Because they are talking about two different resources, they are two different policy definitions. So I'm going to add the storage account ones, and I'm going to add the virtual machine ones. Now, when I go and put them in, I actually want to set which of these are allowed. So for storage accounts, I'll allow the standard ones, but I don't want to allow any of the premium ones. And for the virtual machines, we have some rather expensive virtual machines. These ones here, the standard E-Series, our E-Series virtual machines, if you pick the right one, can land you with around about $5,000 US a month as a bill. They're really super grunty machines and they have some great capabilities. But I don't want people mucking around and creating E-series machines just because I think it's a good idea, because, you know, more power, and it then ending up on my bill. So I can turn around and say, hey, actually, I only want these particular SKUs to be able to be selected when somebody's creating a new resource inside Azure. So that's gone ahead and saved that definition. Sorry, back on my definition screen. Oh. Now I want to go ahead and assign it. So creating it is one thing, but then once I have created it, here's my expensive SKUs, I need to put it somewhere and say what level or where is this going to apply to. So at the moment, I'm actually applying it to the scope up here, which is my subscription. So this is going to apply any resource group inside this subscription. I want this policy to take an effect. I can put some exclusions in here. So if I want to protect one subscription but go, hey, you know what, we do actually have one particular resource group where I need some more expensive machines in there, I can exclude that resource group, for example. Review and create. And that's pretty much it as far as assigning policies goes. And now that will be protected. Now, a couple of things with that. So this one in particular, when you're preventing the expensive SKUs from being created, if someone was to go and spin up a new virtual machine inside the portal, they would get an error that it would fail against the policy and that would be denied. If they go ahead and do it via an ARM template or PowerShell, for example, they'll still get that error, but sometimes the process isn't quite as linear. And so if I do it via a PowerShell command to create a new VM, it doesn't evaluate all the policies first. It goes ahead and starts creating stuff. So I might end up with a network security group or a storage account, for example, before I hit the VM failing because the VM SKU is too big. Just to be aware of if you find little resources popping up and you wonder why it kind of looks like it half went, even though you got this big red error to say that it failed against the policy. And then in our compliance section, we can actually see which resources aren't compliant. So I've got this one here. I mentioned the enable monitoring in the Azure Security Center. I'm at 86% compliant. So I've actually got 23 of my resources that are not currently compliant. And I can go in and see which of the particular policies are failing and what the resources are that this is failing against. So I need to go in and do a little bit of work here to fix these ones because I haven't set it up to auto-remediate. If you want to be up to speed with the latest work that we're doing in terms of releasing Azure policy definitions, we have a GitHub repo. Now, I am a systems administrator. GitHub is not my happy place, but I'm learning, and I'm learning really fast because it's a great place for PowerShell scripts and things like Azure policy. And Microsoft can release stuff into GitHub for you to download, play with, comment on, open issues a lot quicker than we can get new stuff pushed into the Azure portal. So it's a really good place to look at for official stuff that hasn't quite made it into the Azure portal yet. And last but not least, in terms of this policy definition stuff, is Azure Blueprints. Now, once upon a time, if you wanted to create these rules and regulations for your resource groups or your subscriptions, the highest level you could do that was at a subscription level. We didn't have anything called management groups. There was no way of pushing that stuff across more than one subscription. I literally would have to define it for every single subscription that I had inside my tenancy. What we've done with Azure Blueprints, and this is a service in preview still at the moment, is we've made it so that you can set up and define your role-based access controls, the policies that you want to enforce, and which Azure Resource Manager templates that you want to use, and you can even set that certain resource groups must get created and defined what they are as well. So we roll that all up as a blueprint, and then we can scale it across more than one subscription and know that any new subscription that gets created, that gets put inside that same management group, will apply and inherit all of these standards and policies that we've got in place. So for our Azure Blueprints, Very similar to policies in terms of having a definition. If we go into one that I've already created, I've got one here at the moment called IT Shared Standard. So I've created a blueprint here that says, look, if it's any shared resource across my cloud, I want to set the network contributor role and put a certain AD user group in that. I want to audit that virtual machines that don't have disaster recovery configured, because that can be an issue. I want to make sure that that's all on. Something in there for function apps, and there's one particular resource group that I want to allow. Now I'm going to edit this blueprint because there's something extra that I want to add in here into my artifacts. I'm going to go and add in, add in at that level. I want to go and add in a new policy. So if I have a look at all the different artifact types that I can put into this blueprint, I'm going to use a policy assignment, and I've got one in here. The initiative definitions. There you go. So I have an audit for NIST requirements to make sure that there are specific VM extensions that are deployed for my VMs that support those security controls. So if I go in and add that, it'll save that blueprint as a draft. I love it when the internet goes slow. Come on, thank you. We'll go and save that as a draft. I know friends don't let friends right-click and publish, but I'm going to go right-click and publish the blueprint. Sorry, Damo. Give it a version number, give it some change notes. And if I was with my salt, I would have actually added in there that I'd added in the NIST policy. And then again, right-click and assign it and say, okay, which management group level do I actually want this blueprint to apply to? Blueprints are good. Azure Portal's fun, but we like doing stuff with PowerShell. And again, PowerShell commands in terms of getting things updated into that library can be a little bit slower than what we need to be able to manage their environments. And so Jim Britt, who is on our Azure governance team, has a GitHub repo where he has some commands for managing Azure blueprints via PowerShell. That gives you the ability to export those blueprint definitions, import them and rename them, or run a report to see what blueprints have been assigned where inside your Azure tenancies. Cool thing about that is it gives you the ability, for example, to go in and set up a blueprint in those test management groups to apply to your test subscription, make any changes, get it perfect, no, it's not going to break anything, export that blueprint definition, and then go and import the blueprint definition, give it a new name, and import it into your production management group so that it now applies into your production environment. You will still need to go into the portal and assign it once it's been imported, because it does get imported up as a draft, and we will officially see these commands in the proper PowerShell libraries in time. If you are an Azure DevOps pipeline-y person, which I am not, we are also doing some good work in that space with my colleague Neil Peterson. So Neil Peterson has built in some extensions for Azure pipelines so that you could build in blueprints as part of those deployment pipelines as well for Azure DevOps. So that probably means a whole lot more to you than it does to me, but if you're interested in learning more, have a look at Neil's GitHub repo, and he's done some great work there with that. And again, eventually we will see that rolled into the Azure Pipelines policies too. Now my favorite part, cost management. I'm 7 degrees away from Satya Nadella in the Microsoft chain of command. The great thing about that is that none of this chain of command is sales or marketing. That means I'm one of the very few people in Microsoft that can talk to you about how to spend less money in our cloud. You see, we quite often see comments like this, and I did have to edit it because I didn't want people to think I was taking a dig at AWS, because really cloud, right? It's not about paying for what you use, it's about paying for what you forgot to turn off. And that kind of hit home because, last time I checked it had 12,500 likes. There were a few people that kind of agreed with this statement. So if we're going to do cost management right in the cloud, we need to estimate it accurately in the first place. We need to manage the consumption as we go along. And we need to review the spend in context of the benefits that we've received from having stuff in the cloud. It's not always about spending less if spending more has meant that we've had more customer demand or we're getting more benefit from that spend. When it comes to estimating cloud costs, there are a few design decisions that have an impact on how much things are going to cost you. To start with, managed disks. Managed disks inside Azure are paid for based on the capacity of how much disk space you have asked for, not how much disk space you are using. If you have provisioned a 1 terabyte drive, you are paying for a 1 terabyte drive, whether you're using half a gig or nearly 1 terabyte. Design decisions like that matter. Start small and scale up when you manage disks. Tiers in terms of the tiering of these machines and whether or not we've got standard or low priority or basic tiering. Now, that's a design decision when you create a virtual machine, and that also has an impact on cost, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Replication between one region and another can impact traffic costs. And the region that you put your resources in is going to be priced differently from one region to another. Now, that kind of blew my mind when I first heard about it, because I thought, well, why does it cost me more to spin up a resource in one Asia region than another? What happened to this cloud thing that's all over the world and I can just use the cloud, right? But it turns out, funnily enough, that data centers cost different amounts to run in different locations. Electricity is different, land's different, land taxes are different, labor to run those data centers is different, the markets are different, and so pricing is based per region. Now, does it make sense to go and figure out what the cheapest region is and put all your resources there? No, because then you get hit with the traffic. You get hit with traffic between regions, and then you get hit with cost. Apart from the fact that you're possibly also getting hit with more latency, depending on where the regions are compared to where your users are. So those little things are important. We have some tools to help you try and estimate your costs better. The app migration tool will let you point at a .NET app, either public-facing or running an agent on an on-prem one that's not available to the internet, to help you assess how much it would cost if you were running that in the Azure App Service. We've also got Azure Migrate, and while Azure Migrate is often seen as literally a migration tool to get virtual machine workloads from our tin on-prem into the cloud, it also does cost analysis. So it looks at the size and the resources of that on-prem VM and then compares that to what sort of SKU you would need and how much that would cost you to run in the cloud as well. At the moment, it only supports VMware and Hyper-V VMs and not server hosts themselves, so not Server 2016 installed on-prem on the actual tin, but that physical server costing and support in Azure Migrate is on the roadmap. It's just not available yet. And we also have an Azure pricing calculator. Now, I don't know how many people know about that, but the Azure pricing calculator confused the heck out of me when I first looked at it. And the main reason it did was because I am used to scoping up physical machines. And when I scope a physical machine, I know what size it is physically, how many CPUs I need, what storage I'm going to throw at it, the RAM, all of those things I take into consideration when I'm scoping up the cost of a machine. What we do in Azure is we go and call them instances. And with these instances, we go, oh, you want an A series, or you want an F series, or you don't want an E series, they're the really expensive ones. But then we kind of break it down, and you want a D2 S3. All right, what? And so the best tip that I was given for pricing was think of instances as like t-shirt sizes. So when you rocked up today to grab your hoodie, what did you have the choice of? Small, medium, large, extra large, right? Instances are like t-shirt sizes. So those t-shirts have different specifications for the length of the arm, the length of the body, the circumference of the sleeves. You know, if it wasn't a hoodie, the circumference of the neck. All of those different sizings make up a small or a medium or a large. And that's what we do with instances. We bundle together a set of common configurations and call them a small, a medium, or large. Best thing you can do is in the pricing calculator, there is these little info buttons under more info. One in particular, the pricing details and the product details. And the product details, if you click on that, actually takes you straight into the documentation that says these are the different instance series and when we recommend you should use them, and then gives you a listing of all the different specs under a D or an F or an E. I'm finding that even less people know that we actually have a total cost of ownership calculator. So the Azure total cost of ownership calculator kind of seems like a neat marketing trick. It's one of those, let me show you how cheap it is to run in the cloud so you can turn off all your on-prem kit. That's kind of how the TCO calculator comes across. However, what the TCO calculator is superpower actually is the way that it forces you to think about what the real cost is of the stuff that you're running on-prem. So inside our total cost of ownership calculator, I'm going to go in and add a couple of servers. So I'm going to say, why don't I take 3 servers, 4 processors, because they're pretty big. Nobody runs single core. 1 gig of RAM, no way, let me try 32 gig. Now, I can turn on that server is a Windows Server 2008 or 2008 R2 machine. If I do that, it takes into account that if I was to leave that server on-prem, I would need to be paying for security updates once that product goes end of life, if I left it on-prem. I can go in and add details about the databases, the storage, you know, what disks is that running, how much am I backing up, what have I got in archive storage, all of those kind of things. So that's sort of fairly standard so far, right? Now we get into the interesting stuff. So we've got Azure Hybrid benefit, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Are we using that? Are we replicating to different geographies? Because that's going to take a cost. Now we get into some of the fun assumptions. How much does your electricity cost per kilowatt hour? How many organizations know that? So we've put together some assumptions based on what we found from industry standards, how much it costs to procure your storage, how many servers a full-time admin can look after on-prem, and how much they get paid. That needs to go up a little bit, right? And then we've also got a bunch of, I spoke about electricity costs, power ratings, data center costs, how many racks do you require for these different configurations, how much does it cost you to construct a rack in your data center, what's the useful life of that, for example, and then things like networking costs. So network hardware and software costs as a percentage, and maintenance and service provider costs. So all of these little things that it's really hard to do an apples versus apples comparison about when you're just used to looking at the specs of a physical box. Now, is it going to be cheaper to put it in the cloud? Of course it's going to be. I wasn't going to show it to you if it was going to be, you know, less expensive to keep it on-prem, right? But it's not the graph that impresses me. This is not a sales pitch to tell you that yes, it's cheaper to stick all your stuff in the cloud. It's about getting the level of breakdown. So now we're starting to get some information. Say, look, this one here's the cloud. Your compute costs actually go up, but your IT labor costs go down. And if you want a side-by-side comparison, this is how we break it down. And over 5 years, we break it down even further. So if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of cost comparison, you've got someone in your organization that wants to have this level of a conversation about why cloud versus on-prem, it's a good place to go to give you some more ammo and to really make you think about what a lot of those on-prem costs are that you might not necessarily think top of mind when you're having that conversation. Purchasing options, because there are ways to make things cheaper in the cloud. So let's take a look. Number one, hard limit subscriptions for training. If you have staff that are learning the cloud and they want to play with stuff in Azure, do not add them to your enterprise agreement or put them on a pay-as-you-go subscription, especially if you haven't added the policy to stop them creating E-series virtual machines, right? Use things like MSDN subscriptions, which give you a limit per month of a certain amount of dollars for that person to go and do their playing and their training, and they cannot spend more than that in a month. Protect yourself. Look at dev and test subscriptions. So dev and test subscription types do have lower pricing for some workloads in the cloud for those kind of environments that literally are just dev and test. Look at Azure Dev Test Labs. The Azure Dev Test Labs have some things that are built in to help you control the spend a little easier, including things like easy controls for automatically shutting down virtual machines at the end of the day to make sure that they're not left running overnight, that kind of stuff. So Azure Dev Test Labs just has some inbuilt cost functions that are easier. Low priority VMs might be an option. So low priority VMs use extra capacity inside our data centers when it's available. They do not guarantee that your server will be running 24/7. That's not what they're for. But if you're doing something long term, if you've got a data set that you want to do some batch processing on and you don't really care how long it takes to run, there are some options there where a low priority VM might be a valid option and will be significantly cheaper than a production server. Reserved instances give you the ability to commit to 1 year or 3 years worth of Azure Cloud consumption and get a discount for committing to that amount. And Azure Hybrid Benefit I mentioned before. So Azure Hybrid Benefit is when you have a license on a server and you're bringing that server to the cloud and you're turning that server off on-prem if you already own that server license and that server license is enrolled for software assurance. Those are the caveats. If you bring along one of those licenses, BYO license will give you a discount on the running of the Azure virtual machine because you're not needing to pay for the licensing as part of the cost anymore. Now, we got a little bit of media flack for this recently. I don't know if anybody is aware, because we went and adjusted the wording of the terms and conditions around Azure Hybrid Benefit. And we turned around and said, look, what we're finding is that the intention for that was if you are moving an on-prem license into a cloud environment. And what we're seeing with things like dedicated hosting is people are using cloud providers, but as their own environment, as a dedicated host, as not part of a public cloud infrastructure, and they're still wanting to get credit for moving over and using that same license, and that wasn't the intention. And so we decided to update the terms and conditions to say Azure Hybrid Benefit does not apply if you are going to spin up a VM as a dedicated host in anybody's cloud. What it came across as was we weren't going to let you do that, move your own license into AWS or into Google Cloud. Guess what? You can't do it in Azure either. So we've set it to strongly say, even if you were to purchase dedicated hosting inside Azure, Hybrid Benefit doesn't apply. Managing your cloud spend. If you leave this room today and you only do one thing, or you only remember one thing I said, I want it to be Azure budgets. Azure budgets are the canary in the coal mine that will alert you if your cloud spend is getting too big. And I'm going to show you how easy they are to set up. So, inside my subscription, we have this whole section in Azure called Cost Management, and this is a whole bunch of budgets that have been set up inside the subscription. Now you can see the little dots going bleep, bleep, bleep. It's currently going through my subscription and calculating for each of these different budgets where they're at, and it would eventually go in and fill in those progress bars. But I want to go and add a new one. So I'm going to go and create a new budget, and I'm going to leave this at the moment at the Contoso demo. So this is my subscription level, but I don't want to apply this budget to the entire subscription. I can turn around and say, hey, I only want to look at particular Azure meters. I only want to look at particular Azure resource groups, or resource types. Just give me a budget for all of the virtual machines, for example. But the other thing that we talked about earlier was tags. And remember, tags don't care where the resource is inside the subscription. So I'm going to say, hey, I want to look at anything that is tagged. Where's my environment? Anything that has got a tag called environment, and the value is development or dev. So it's the only thing that I'm looking at for this particular budget. I'm just going to call it dev tags. I'm going to set it to be monthly. You have a look at the bottom here. It's thrown in an amount. So it's actually put $24 in there. I didn't type that in. So what it's done is it's gone through my current spend and said, hey, in the subscription, all the resources tagged with the environment tag with dev or development have been costing you around about $24 a month. Okay, that's nice. I'm going to be a little bit more generous than that because I think that I'm going to be doing a bunch more work on those environments at the moment. So I'm going to change that and I'm going to say, hey, look, let's just bump that up to $100 a month because I'm happy spending $100 a month. So now when I go next, what percentage levels am I setting this budget at? So I want to know when it hits 50%, I want to know when it hits 75%, and I want to know when it hits 90%. And what I can do with this particular scope is I can set an email that it will go to, that it will tell me that that budget has been hit when it hits those particular different thresholds. So a couple of things. Azure budgets will not stop anything. They will not turn things off. If you hit your budget thresholds or you hit the top level 100% of your budget, your things will still run. It is up to somebody to make sure that they're checking that email and then going in and doing something about it or making a decision that that's actually okay because we've had a busy month and we're happy to spend some more money. That's all good. The other thing is that on some of the scopes, so for example, at a resource group scope I know especially, you can build in some automations and you can actually pump out to some runbooks. So that is interesting if you want to turn around and go, hey, this environment inside this resource group, if it does get a bit expensive, I actually want to shut down the VMs that are inside that resource group. Or I want to spin off some other notifications into some other systems, for example. So you can actually build some automation off those budgets alerts. So I do not want to hear that anybody was surprised by the amount that was on their Azure bill or charged to their credit card at the end of the month, because that means you didn't go and turn Azure budgets on. So I want you to go home and do that, please. And finally, reviewing your cloud spend. Number one tip, do not start with your invoice. Have you seen an Azure invoice? They're horrible. It's kind of like going to your electricity provider and saying, tell me which of the appliances inside my house is using all my electricity. Now, unless you've got smart metering turned on, that's a different conversation. All your electricity provider sees is the amount of kilowatt hours that you've consumed. I don't know what's going on inside your house. And to your environments in our Azure cloud, to us, are literally just spinning meters. They're spinning their electricity meter about consumption on the different products and services that you're using. So your invoice will look horrible. Don't start with your invoice. Instead, we've built in something called Azure Cost Analysis. And Azure Cost Analysis has amazing power if you know how to use it. When I first looked at it, I went, pretty graphs, big deal. Did not make the connection between what these pretty graphs can actually do. So Azure Cost Analysis gives us the ability to drill down into a better level of detail of what's actually going on inside our subscription. So again, in the Azure portal, we're under the cost management section, and down here under cost analysis, it started by giving me this lovely little graph that's told me I've spent lots and lots of money this month in October. What I can see down the bottom is I've also got some other little graphs. So it's picked up a couple. This is an enterprise agreement, so I've got EA enrollment names, and I can see what it is I'm spending money on. I'm going to take a look at this location, and I can see at the moment BR South, which is my Brazil South region. If I click on here, it'll change that graph at the top, and now that graph is only showing me the Brazil South location. So it's automatically added that as a filter to the top. But now I can start to get fancy and do some grouping. So if I come in here and group it by resource type, what in that location has cost me all this money? And when I come and hover over here, I can see my virtual machine scale sets are the thing located inside that Azure region that have cost me the most money. That's nice. If I click on the blue, the virtual machine scale sets, and just look at that particular detail, now if I click on the group by, because it's popped that up in there, my resource type, and scroll down to resource, now I can see these are my 3 different virtual machine scale sets and how much they've cost me so far in October. So much easier than looking at my invoice. Actually gives me some real granularity in terms of what it is, and I can go into a virtual machine, for example, go and have a look at meters, categories and subcategories, maybe find out that the storage, and then have a look and see that, hey, it was actually hot GRS write operations that month that made that virtual machine so expensive. I can play around and change the pie, and if I go to table, I can actually get a detailed breakdown of the data that month of each of those virtual machine scale sets and the money that they were consuming. So the data's all there. It's just a case of knowing what to click around and play on with those filters. And you can just come up in here and go add filter and build those queries yourself if you want. Or you can click on the pretty little colors. We have a Power BI content pack for Azure consumption. If you are a Power BI fan and you like to play in that world, so that you can build your own dashboards and queries and share that with your organization. So you can just go in and add that content pack inside Power BI. We also have a billing and a consumption API. So if you speak API, you can hook into those to build your own queries and put them through into your own systems and do all the other things that you do with APIs. Just watch out for the emails that we will send you if we make any changes to those APIs. So if we go and change the names of stuff, which sometimes happens, then we'll notify you that those APIs are changing. And we've also announced that you can view your AWS cost data inside our Azure Cost Management tools. Because strangely enough, we have some customers that want to use more than one cloud, and so now we're giving you the granularity to see your AWS costs inside our tools. You can stack them on top of your Azure costs to get a total picture of your cloud spend across those 2 environments, or you can use the slicing and dicing that I showed you in terms of playing around with that graph to analyze your AWS spend as well. There is a caveat with that. I hate people leaving the room and then finding out there was a gotcha. The gotcha is there is a cost, and the cost, if it's kicked in already, because I don't think it was a cost when it was released in preview, but the cost is / will be 1% of your AWS spend. So just be aware that that's not a free service. It's not a free service because AWS charges us for access into that information into your AWS account. But the cost management calls are pretty cool for analyzing it and being able to see that big picture if you're using more than one cloud. Documentation there, if you want to have a play with it, this is direct links to the stuff on docs.microsoft.com. My number 1 tip if you're having issues finding anything in docs.microsoft.com is to use your favorite search engine, type in this term you're looking for, and then put docs.microsoft.com in the search term, and you will find access into that information, but there's a couple of quick links for you. I have covered quite a bit today, from policies, configuration, compliance enforcements, right through to cost management. If you want to learn more, we have some online interactive free training at Microsoft Learn. At the moment, we've got content up there for role-based access control, and we've got stuff up there for cost management. Last time I checked, the cost management module didn't include budgets. So guess who's now responsible for running a module for Azure budgets to get that inside Microsoft Learn? So that's one of the things I've got to work on with the product group. In addition to that, as I said, it can be sometimes a challenge to find stuff inside Docs, so here are some quick links if you want to learn more about Azure governance in general, Azure policy, Azure blueprints, and of course the slide deck will be available for you to get to that as well. And here's pretty much a wrap up. So this is what we've talked about: organize your cloud things, tag your resources, restrict who's got access to what, use Azure policy to enforce and audit things, use Azure blueprints to scale that across all your subscriptions, Use the tools to estimate your costs. Watch how you're purchasing things because that can affect the costs. Set your Azure budgets and use your Azure cost management tools to analyze your spend. I know it's been a long day. Conferences are mentally draining. I thank you so much for your time and enjoy the rest of your night. Thanks.